They paid just $875 for a crumbling estate everyone called cursed, and when the auctioneers laughed, when the town mocked them, when even their own children begged them to walk away, this elderly couple opened the door anyway. And what they found buried 3 floors beneath the condemned mansion would expose a 70-year-old secret worth over $300 million, rewrite history, and prove that sometimes the greatest fortunes aren't found by the young and fearless, but by the old and stubborn enough to believe. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves through the mountains of rural Virginia, curling through the hollow where Marlowe and Desta Hicks had lived for the past 43 years. Their trailer sat at the end of a gravel road that turned to mud when it rained, tucked between oak trees so old they remembered wars and floods, and generations of people who'd tried to make something of this hard, beautiful land. Marlowe, 72 years old with hands gnarled from arthritis and a back bent from 4 decades of carrying mail through snow and heat, sat on the wooden steps he'd built himself in 1997. The paint had peeled off years ago. He didn't have the money to replace it, and honestly, he didn't much care. The steps still held him, still did their job, and that was enough. Beside him, Desta adjusted her reading glasses, the frames held together with electrical tape at one corner. She was 70, small-boned and sharp-eyed, with silver hair she kept in a bun because haircuts cost money they didn't have. Her hands, stained with soil from the garden she tended to keep their grocery bills low, turned the pages of a library book about estate sales and auctions. She'd been reading it for 2 weeks, renewing it twice because the due date kept coming before she finished. They didn't speak much these days, not because they'd run out of things to say, but because after 48 years of marriage, silence had become its own language. Marlowe watched a hawk circle above the tree line. Desta marked her page with a grocery receipt and closed the book. Their Social Security checks came to $1,832 a month combined. Rent on the trailer was $400. Electricity ran about $90 in summer, $160 in winter. Medication for Marlowe's heart condition cost $287, even with Medicare. Desta's blood pressure pills added another $93. Groceries, if they were careful, stayed under $300. That left roughly $200 a month for everything else: gas, phone, emergencies, life. They didn't eat out. They didn't take vacations. They hadn't bought new clothes in 6 years. Desta cut Marlowe's hair in the kitchen with scissors she'd owned since 1981, and Marlowe fixed everything that broke with duct tape, wire, and prayers because calling a repairman wasn't an option. Their daughter Rachel lived 3 states away and called every other Sunday. She'd offered to help financially, but Marlowe and Desta always said no. Rachel had 3 kids in college, a mortgage, her own life. They wouldn't be a burden. They'd survived worse. But lately, Marlowe had been feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not desperation, not exactly. More like a quiet ache, a sense that time was running out faster than he'd expected. He'd started having chest pains in July. He hadn't told Desta. She worried enough already. He wanted to leave her something, anything, more than a rusted trailer and a burial plot they'd already paid for. He wanted one last adventure, one final proof that he'd been more than just a man who delivered mail and paid bills and waited to die. That's when he saw the notice. It was tacked to the bulletin board at the county courthouse, half hidden behind flyers for firewood and used tractors. Estate auction, it read in bold black letters. Belcastle Manor, Lot 47, condemned property, sold as is. No warranties, no inspections. Buyer assumes all liability. Demolition scheduled for November 15th. Marlowe stood in front of that board for 15 minutes, staring at the grainy photograph stapled beneath the text. The mansion looked like something from a Gothic novel. 3 stories of weathered stone, tall windows boarded with plywood, a turret on the east wing, and wrought iron gates strangled by ivy. The front steps had crumbled. Part of the roof had caved in. Yellow caution tape stretched across the entrance. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He pulled the notice off the board, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from the chest pains, but from something else entirely. Hope, maybe, or madness. That night, after a dinner of beans and cornbread, Marlowe spread the notice across the kitchen table. Desta looked at it, then at him, her eyes narrowing in that way that meant she already knew what he was thinking and wasn't sure if she should encourage it or talk him out of it. Belcastle Manor, she read aloud. Condemned. Marlowe, this place has been rotting for decades. Nobody's lived there since the 80s. I know, he said. It's probably full of black mold, asbestos, God knows what else. Probably. The roof's falling in. Yep. She folded her arms. So why are you looking at it like it's a winning lottery ticket? Marlowe ran his thumb across the photograph, tracing the outline of the turret. When I was a kid, my grandfather used to drive me past this place. Said it was built in 1923 by a man named Thornton Belcastle. He was an art dealer, travelled all over Europe, brought back paintings and sculptures, fancy stuff. Grandpa said Belcastle was mysterious, never let anyone inside except for private showings. Then one day in 1987 he died, and the family just abandoned it, locked the gates and walked away. Desta studied his face. You've been thinking about this place for 50 years. Marlowe smiled faintly. Not thinking. Dreaming, maybe. Dreams don't pay property taxes, she said, but her voice had softened. Auctions on Saturday, Marlowe said. Minimum bid is $500. Desta's eyes widened. Marlowe, we don't have $500 to gamble on a death trap. He reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers rough and warm against hers. Desta, we've been careful our whole lives. Saved every penny, never took risks, did everything right. And here we are, 70 years old, eating beans in a trailer that leaks when it rains. Maybe, just maybe, it's time to do something reckless. She should have said no. Every practical bone in her body screamed to say no. But when she looked into Marlowe's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Fire. How much can we actually spend? She asked quietly. Marlowe swallowed. I've got $875 in the savings account. It's supposed to be for emergencies, but you think this is an emergency, she finished. He nodded. An emergency of the soul. Desta laughed despite herself, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. You're a foolish old man, Marlowe Hicks. Does that mean you're coming with me? She squeezed his hand. Someone has to keep you from doing something stupid. The auction was held on a cold Saturday morning in late October. Frost clung to the grass, and the sky hung low and grey, threatening rain. Marlowe and Desta drove their 1998 Ford Ranger down the winding mountain roads toward Belcastle Manor, the truck's heater coughing out lukewarm air, the radio playing staticky bluegrass. They didn't talk much during the drive. Desta clutched her purse in her lap, the $875 in cash folded inside an envelope. Marlowe's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles white. When they turned onto the long, overgrown driveway leading to the estate, Desta gasped softly. The photographs hadn't done it justice. Belcastle Manor rose from the hillside like a sleeping giant, massive and wounded, its stone walls stained with age and weather. The windows were dark, boarded eyes staring at nothing. The grounds, once manicured, had surrendered to wildness. Vines climbed the walls, weeds choked the fountain. The iron gates hung crooked on rusted hinges, but beneath the decay, Desta could see the bones of grandeur, the arched doorways, the carved balustrades, the sheer ambition of someone who'd built this place to last forever. There were maybe 30 people gathered in the gravel lot near the entrance. Most were contractors in work boots and reflective vests, flipping through clipboards, talking about salvage value and demolition costs. A few were curiosity seekers, locals who'd come to watch the spectacle. One man had a camera and a notepad, probably a reporter from the county paper. Marlowe and Desta parked at the edge of the lot and walked slowly toward the crowd. They stood out immediately, an elderly couple in threadbare coats, moving carefully over uneven ground, looking like they'd wandered into the wrong event. Someone snickered. Marlowe heard it, but didn't turn. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Dale Pritchard, with a voice like gravel in a blender, stood on a makeshift platform near the front steps. He wore a cowboy hat and a bolo tie, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "All right, folks," he called out, "let's get this over with. You've all seen the property disclosure. This here's a condemned structure. County says it's unsafe for occupancy. Roofs compromised, foundations questionable, and there's likely environmental hazards. Buyer takes possession as is, and you got 60 days to either restore it to code or tear it down. Demolition's already scheduled if nobody bids. Any questions?" A contractor raised his hand. "What's the minimum?" $500, Dale said. "And before you get excited, let me remind you, the property taxes are $11,000 a year. There's about $43,000 in liens from the county, and you're looking at a $250,000 restoration if you're lucky, $500,000 if you're realistic." The crowd murmured. Several people walked back to their trucks. Desta leaned close to Marlowe. "Did you know about the liens?" Marlowe's jaw tightened. "No." "We can't afford that," she whispered. "We need to leave." But Marlowe didn't move. He stood there, staring up at the mansion, at the turret where he imagined Thornton Castle once stood, looking out over the valley, dreaming his own dreams. "All right," Dale called. "Let's start the bidding. Do I hear 500? Silence. "Come on now," Dale said, irritation creeping into his voice. 500 for a historic property, 12 acres of land, somebody give me 5. More silence. A voice from the back shouted, "It's a money pit, Dale. Nobody's that stupid." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Dale sighed. 400 then. Anybody? Nothing. 300? Marlowe's hand started to rise. Desta grabbed his wrist. "Marlowe." "No," she hissed. But he lifted his hand anyway. The crowd turned. People stared, some confused, some amused. Dale squinted at them. "Sir, you're bidding 300? Marlowe's voice came out stronger than he felt. "Yes, sir." A few people chuckled. One contractor muttered, "What's an old-timer going to do with a condemned mansion?" Dale looked uncomfortable. "Sir, you understand what you're bidding on?" "I do," Marlowe said. "You got the cash to back it up?" Marlowe felt his face flush, but he nodded. Dale shrugged. "All right, I got 300. Do I hear 350? Silence. 350? Anybody? Dale's gavel hovered. Going once. Going twice. Another voice, gruff and mocking. Better make it quick before he changes his mind or his heart gives out. Harsh laughter erupted. Desta's grip on Marlowe's arm tightened, but she didn't pull him away. Instead, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and glared at the crowd with a ferocity that made several people look away. "Sold," Dale announced, bringing the gavel down with a sharp crack. "To the gentleman in the back for $300. The crowd dispersed quickly, most people shaking their heads, a few casting pitying glances at the elderly couple who'd just bought a collapsing mansion for the price of a used lawnmower. Marlowe and Desta approached the platform where Dale waited with a stack of paperwork. "You folks sure about this?" Dale asked, his tone gentler now. "I gotta be honest, this place is a liability. You'd be better off walking away." "We're sure," Desta said firmly. Dale sighed and pulled out the contract. "All right. Name?" "Marlowe Hicks." Dale wrote it down, then looked up. "There's fees on top of the bid. Transfer taxes, recording fees, county processing. Brings the total to $875. Marlowe and Desta exchanged glances. It was exactly what they had. Exactly. Desta opened her purse, pulled out the envelope, and counted the bills onto the table. $875 in worn 20s, 10s, and 5s, money that smelled like their trailer, like years of saving for emergencies that never quite came. Dale counted it twice, then slid a receipt across the table along with a heavy iron key, old and tarnished, attached to a leather strap. "Congratulations," he said without enthusiasm. "You're now the proud owners of Belcastle Manor. Good luck. You'll need it." They drove away in silence, the key resting in Marlowe's lap, the deed folded in Desta's purse. Neither spoke until they were halfway home. "What did we just do?" Desta finally asked. Marlowe stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "Something my grandfather would have been proud of, I think. Or something he would have talked you out of." Marlowe smiled faintly. "Probably both." That night they couldn't sleep. They lay in their narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the wind shake the trailer's thin walls. "We can't afford the taxes," Desta said into the darkness. "I know. We can't afford to fix it. I know. So what's the plan?" Marlowe turned to look at her, her profile barely visible in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "I don't have one," he admitted. I couldn't let it go." Desta reached for his hand. "Then we figure it out together." The next morning, Sunday, they drove back to Belcastle Manor. The sky was clear, and the autumn sun painted the stone walls gold and amber. Without the crowd, without the auctioneers' warnings ringing in their ears, the place felt different, quieter, more patient. Marlowe parked the truck near the front steps. They sat for a moment, gathering courage. "Ready?" he asked. Desta nodded. "Let's see what we bought." They walked slowly across the weed-choked courtyard, past the broken fountain where moss grew thick and green, up the crumbling front steps. Marlowe pulled the iron key from his pocket. It was heavier than it looked, solid and cold. The lock was surprisingly smooth. The key turned with a deep, satisfying click. Marlowe pushed. The door groaned, its hinges screaming in protest, but it opened. The smell hit them first. Dust, old wood, stone, and something else, something faintly floral, like dried lavender. The entrance hall stretched before them, vast and shadowy. A chandelier hung from the high ceiling, its crystals dulled by decades of dust. A grand staircase curved upward into darkness. The walls were panelled in dark wood, and despite the boarded windows, thin shafts of light pierced the gaps, illuminating floating dust motes like snow in sunlight. Desta stepped inside, her footsteps echoing. "Oh, Marlowe," she breathed. He followed, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The floor was marble, cracked in places but still intact. A massive fireplace dominated the far wall, its mantel carved with intricate designs, vines, flowers, birds. They moved deeper into the house, room by room. The parlour still held furniture, draped in white sheets like ghosts. The library's shelves were empty, but the walls were lined with built-in cases that reached the ceiling. The kitchen was enormous, with an old cast-iron stove and a sink the size of a bathtub. Everywhere they looked, decay battled with beauty. Water stains bloomed across ceilings, wallpaper peeled like old skin. But the craftsmanship underneath, the bones of the place, remained solid, defiant. They climbed the grand staircase slowly, testing each step before putting their weight on it. The second floor held bedrooms, 6 in total, each with its own fireplace. The third floor was the turret, a round room with windows on all sides, offering views of the valley below, the mountains beyond, the endless sky above. Marlowe stood in the center of that room and turned slowly in a circle. For the first time in years, he felt something close to joy. They spent hours exploring, losing track of time. It was Desta who found the first clue. She'd been examining the parlour, running her hand along the wood panelling, when her fingers caught on something. A seam, almost invisible. She pressed, and a section of the wall clicked. "Marlowe!" she called. He came quickly, his footsteps hurried. "What is it?" Desta pointed. There's a panel here. It's loose. Together, they pried it open. Behind the panel was a small cavity, and inside, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact. Marlowe lifted it carefully and opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat, old-fashioned. Property of Thornton Bell Castle, it read. Commenced January 1924. Desta leaned close. It's his diary. They read standing up, too excited to sit. The entries were mundane at first. Notes about construction, lists of furniture purchases, observations about the weather. But as they turned pages, the tone shifted. One entry from 1938 read, "Acquired 3 pieces in Paris. Documentation secured. Transport arranged through usual channels. The world is burning, but beauty must be saved." Another from 1943, "Met with the family today. They wept when I showed them what I'd preserved. How many more can I save before it's too late?" Marlowe and Desta looked at each other, their pulses quickening. "He was hiding something," Desta whispered. "Saving something." They kept reading, but the journal ended abruptly in 1986, the final entry simply stating, "Health failing. Time running short. Must finish the catalogue. They will never understand." "Catalogue of what?" Marlowe muttered. They searched the parlour more carefully now, examining every panel, every corner. Nothing. The light was fading outside. They'd been in the house for nearly 6 hours. "We should go," Desta said reluctantly. "It'll be dark soon." Marlowe nodded, but as they walked toward the entrance hall, he noticed something. Near the staircase, a door they'd assumed was a closet. He opened it. Stairs, leading down. Desta joined him, peering into the darkness. Basement? Marlowe pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. "Let's find out." The stairs were stone, narrow and steep. They descended carefully, the air growing cooler with each step. At the bottom, they found themselves in a large cellar, its ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. The walls were stone, the floor dirt. But what stopped them cold was the door at the far end. It was steel, modern, completely out of place in the 19th century cellar, and unlike everything else in the house, it showed no signs of age, no rust, no damage. Marlowe approached it slowly. There was a keyhole, but also something else. Fresh oil glistening on the hinges. Desta's voice was barely a whisper. "Marlowe, someone's been here." He touched the door handle. It was cold, smooth. He tried it, locked. But as he stepped back, his boot kicked something in the dirt. He bent down and picked it up. A business card, new, maybe a few weeks old. The edges weren't even dirty. Desta shined her phone light on it. The card read, "Caldwell Acquisitions, Private Estate Liquidation," followed by a phone number. They stood in the darkness, their breathing loud in the silence, staring at a locked steel door that shouldn't exist, in a basement that smelled faintly of oil and secrets, holding evidence that someone else knew this house held something worth finding. And whatever it was behind that door. Marlowe and Desta didn't sleep that night. They sat at their kitchen table, under the flickering fluorescent light, the business card placed between them like evidence at a crime scene. Caldwell Acquisitions. The name meant nothing to them, but the implications meant everything. Someone else knew about the house. Someone with resources, with purpose. Someone who'd been inside recently enough to leave fresh oil on those hinges and drop a business card that hadn't even collected dust yet. "We should call the police," Desta said, her voice tight. Marlowe shook his head slowly. "And tell them what? That we found a locked door in a house we just bought? That someone might have been there before us? We don't even know if anything's been stolen or if there's anything to steal." Desta wrapped her hands around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. "Then what do we do?" Marlowe looked at her, exhaustion and determination fighting for control of his features. "We go back. We find out what's behind that door, and we do it tomorrow before anyone else gets there first." The next morning arrived with fog so thick it swallowed the mountains whole. Marlowe and Desta loaded the truck with tools, a crowbar, bolt cutters, flashlights, and Marlowe's old camping lanterns from when they used to take Rachel hiking 40 years ago. The batteries were new, purchased with the last $20 from Desta's grocery budget. They drove in silence through the white world, the fog pressing against the windshield like something alive. When they reached Belcastle Manor, the house materialized from the mist like a ship emerging from clouds, ancient and patient. Inside, the darkness felt heavier than the day before, weighted with secrets. They made their way to the basement door, their footsteps echoing through empty rooms. Down the stone stairs, into the cellar. The steel door waited. Marlowe examined the lock carefully. It was modern, complex, the kind that required a specific key or professional tools to open. But the frame around it, the stone it was set into, that was old, vulnerable. He positioned the crowbar at the edge where door met stone and pushed. Nothing. He tried again, throwing his weight into it. A crack appeared in the mortar. Desta added her strength to his. Together they worked the crowbar deeper, prying, levering, muscles burning. Marlowe's chest began to ache, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. With a grinding screech, the frame gave way. The door shifted inward an inch, then another. Marlowe grabbed the edge and pulled. It swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo forever. Behind it, more stairs. These were newer, carved more recently, descending at a steeper angle. Marlowe raised his lantern and started down. Desta followed close behind, one hand on his shoulder for balance. 20 steps. 30. 40. They were going deep beneath the house, far deeper than any normal basement should go. The air grew colder, drier. The walls changed from rough stone to smooth rock, almost like a natural cave. At the bottom, they emerged into a chamber so vast their lantern light barely reached the far walls. The ceiling arched high above them, supported by a mixture of natural rock formations and carefully placed wooden beams. But it was what filled the chamber that stole their breath. Crates, dozens of them, maybe 100, stacked in neat rows, each one labeled with numbers and dates written in white paint. Marlowe approached the nearest one, his hands shaking as he read the label, Lot 47, acquired March 1938, Paris. The crate was sealed with nails that had rusted slightly but still held firm. Marlowe used the crowbar to pry it open. The wood groaned and split. Inside, layers of oilcloth, wax paper, and what looked like archival tissue. Desta helped him peel back the layers. Beneath them, wrapped with meticulous care, was a painting. They lifted it out together, carefully, reverently. Even in the dim lantern light, the colors glowed. A landscape, mountains, a village nestled in a valley. The brushwork was extraordinary, each stroke deliberate and full of life. Marlowe turned it over. On the back, a small label, P. Cézanne, circa 1895, removed from the Rothschild collection, Paris, March 1938. Desta's voice was barely a whisper. Marlowe, the Rothschilds. They were Jewish. 1938, that was. Right before the war, Marlowe finished, his stomach dropping. Right before the Nazis started seizing everything. They moved to another crate, then another. Each one held treasures, paintings, sculptures, decorative arts. Each one bore labels with dates from the late 1930s and early 1940s. Each one listed locations across Europe, Paris, Amsterdam, Prague, Vienna. And each one told the same story. Art seized during the Holocaust, thought lost forever, hidden here beneath a forgotten mansion in rural Virginia. They found manifests tucked into waterproof containers, lists of pieces, provenance documentation, letters. Marlowe unfolded one with trembling hands. It was dated May 1943, written in English but with a German stamp. Herr Belcastle, we have successfully retrieved the Vermeer and 3 Rembrandts from the mansion before the SS arrived. The family escaped to Switzerland last week. They know you have preserved their collection. When this madness ends, they will return for it. Until then, it remains in your care. God willing, we all survive to see that day." Desta sat down hard on a nearby crate, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. "He was saving them," she breathed. "Thornton Belcastle was smuggling art out of Nazi-occupied Europe." Marlowe nodded slowly, pieces clicking together. That's why he was so secretive, why nobody was allowed inside. He wasn't hoarding treasure, he was protecting it until it could be returned. They explored deeper. The first chamber led to a second, smaller but filled with wooden cabinets. Inside these, they found jewelry, gold coins, rare books, all carefully catalogued. One drawer held nothing but rings, each one in its own small box with a note. Rebecca Goldstein, taken from Cologne, 1939. David Klein, removed from Vienna, 1940. Anna Weiss, recovered from Warsaw, 1942. These weren't just valuables. They were people's lives, their histories, the only proof they'd existed before everything was taken from them. The second chamber connected to a third, and when Marlowe and Desta entered it, they both stopped breathing. It was a gallery. The walls had been smoothed and painted white. Track lighting, modern but installed decades ago, ran along the ceiling, though the bulbs were long dead. Mounted on the walls, hung with professional care, were paintings that belonged in the world's greatest museums. Marlowe recognized them from books he'd read, from documentaries Desta had watched. A Rembrandt self-portrait, the artist's eyes piercing even in the dim lantern light. A Monet water lily series, the colors still vibrant, still alive. A Van Gogh landscape, the brushstrokes thick and passionate. A small Vermeer, a woman reading a letter by a window, worth more than some entire museums. There were 32 paintings in that gallery. Marlowe counted them twice, unable to believe what he was seeing. On a small desk in the corner, they found another ledger, this one more detailed. Each painting was listed with its history: original owner, date of acquisition, how it was saved, condition notes, estimated value. At the bottom of the final page, in Thornton Belcastle's careful handwriting, total collection value as of January 1987 estimated at $280 million, adjusted for inflation and market changes. Current value likely exceeds $300 million. Desta made a sound between a laugh and a sob. $300 million, she repeated. "Marlowe, we're standing in $300 million worth of art." He couldn't speak. His chest hurt. His head spun. They were two elderly people living on Social Security, eating beans for dinner, and they'd just stumbled into one of the most valuable private art collections on Earth. They found Thornton's final diary tucked behind the ledger. This one was different from the journal upstairs. This was his confession, his explanation, his plea to whoever found it. The first entry was dated December 1986. "My health is failing faster than I anticipated. The doctors give me 6 months, perhaps less. I always meant to return these pieces myself, to see them home, to meet the families who entrusted them to me. But time has run out. My children don't know about the vault. They think I'm a failed art dealer who wasted his life on a crumbling house. They've made it clear they want nothing to do with this estate. When I die, they'll sell it for whatever they can get and walk away. Perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps whoever buys this place will have a better heart than I gave my own blood credit for." The later entries grew more desperate. "I've hidden documentation for every piece, proof of provenance, letters from the families, everything needed to return these works to their rightful owners. The combinations to the safes are written in code only someone patient enough to care will decipher. I've left legal instructions, but they're sealed until after my death and the sale of the property. Whoever finds this, please, I beg you, don't keep them. Don't sell them for profit. Return them. Give these families back what the Nazis tried to erase forever." The final entry was dated March 5, 1987, just 2 weeks before Thornton died. "I don't know who you are, but if you're reading this, you own this house. You own these pieces legally by purchase, but morally they belong to the survivors, to the descendants, to the world. Do what I couldn't, finish what I started, and if you do, there's a clause in my will, sealed with my attorney, that provides a finder's fee of $5 million to whoever completes the repatriation. Not payment, gratitude. Marlowe closed the diary with shaking hands. Desta was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. He wanted us to find this, Marlowe said quietly. Not his family, not treasure hunters, someone who'd care enough to do the right thing. They sat together in that underground gallery surrounded by centuries of beauty and decades of grief, and they understood the weight they now carried. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. They emerged from the vault as the sun was setting, their minds reeling, their hearts heavy. Marlowe locked the steel door as best he could, though the broken frame wouldn't hold against anyone determined to enter. They drove home in silence, neither able to process what they'd found. That night, Marlowe tried to eat dinner but couldn't taste anything. Desta pushed food around her plate, her eyes distant. Finally, she spoke. "We have to tell someone," she said. "We can't keep this secret." Marlowe nodded. "But who? The police? A museum? The government?" "All of the above, eventually," Desta said. "But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with. We need to document everything, photograph it, make copies of all those papers. We need protection before we go public." The next morning, Desta borrowed a digital camera from their neighbor, claiming they wanted to photograph the house for insurance purposes. They spent 6 hours in the vault, photographing every painting, every crate, every page of documentation. Desta's hands were steadier than Marlowe's, so she took most of the pictures while he organized and labeled. It was during their second trip down, 3 days later, that they noticed something wrong. The door, despite Marlowe's attempts to secure it, was open. Not broken open, just open, as if someone had a key. They froze at the entrance to the first chamber. Everything looked the same at first glance, but Marlowe had a mechanic's eye for detail, and Desta had a librarian's memory for order. A crate had been moved just slightly. Footprints in the dust led toward the gallery. "Someone's been here," Desta breathed. Marlowe's jaw clenched. "Recently." They searched carefully, looking for signs of theft. Nothing seemed missing, but someone had definitely been through the space. Papers had been rifled through. The ledger had been moved. When they climbed back upstairs, they found something that made Desta's blood run cold. A note, placed carefully on the entrance hall floor where they couldn't miss it. The paper was white, expensive. The message was printed in block letters. "Leave what isn't yours. People have died for less. This is your only warning." Marlowe crumpled the note in his fist, fury replacing fear. Desta pulled out her phone and called 911. The sheriff who responded was a tired-looking man in his 50s named Walker. He listened to their story with increasing skepticism, especially when they got to the part about $300 million in Nazi-looted art. "Folks," he said carefully, "I appreciate you're concerned, but you bought a condemned property that's been abandoned for decades. Could be squatters, could be kids, could be nothing. As for this note, without a specific threat or proof of intent, there's not much I can do." "Proof of intent," Desta repeated, her voice rising. "Someone broke into our property and threatened us." Walker held up his hands. "I'll increase patrols in the area, but Mum, between you and me, this estate's been the subject of treasure hunter rumors for 30 years. Every few years someone gets it in their head that old Castle hid something valuable. They poke around, find nothing, move on. This'll blow over." After he left, Marlowe and Desta stood in the entrance hall, frustration and fear warring inside them. "He didn't believe us," Desta said. Marlowe looked up at the grand staircase. at the dust motes floating in shafts of afternoon light. Then we document everything ourselves. We research. We figure out who these Caldwell Acquisitions people are and what they want. Desta spent the next 3 days at the county library, the only place with free internet access. She searched for Caldwell Acquisitions, treasure hunters, Bell Castle estate, and World War II art theft. What she found made her stomach turn. Caldwell Acquisitions was real, but they weren't a legitimate estate liquidation company. They were treasure hunters, the high-end kind, with lawyers and funding and a reputation for acquiring disputed historical artifacts through legal grey areas. They specialized in finding lost art, filing claims as salvagers, and selling to private collectors who didn't ask questions. More disturbing, Desta found forum posts, old ones from the late 1990s and early 2000s, discussing the Bell Castle estate. Rumors had swirled for decades about Thornton's collection. People claimed he'd died with secrets, that his family had sold the house without knowing what it contained, that anyone who got too close to the truth had accidents. One post from 2003 mentioned a historian named David Ehrlich, who'd tried to research Thornton's activities during World War II. He'd filed Freedom of Information requests, interviewed Thornton's former associates, even obtained permits to ground-penetrate scan the property. 3 weeks before his scheduled excavation, he died in a car accident. Single vehicle crash, ruled as falling asleep at the wheel. The post ended with, "Makes you wonder who really wants that estate to stay abandoned." Desta printed everything and brought it home. Marlowe read through it twice, his expression darkening. "They're dangerous," he said finally, "and they know we found something." "So what do we do?" Desta asked. "Walk away? Let them have it?" Marlowe thought of the rings in those drawers, each one with a name, a person, a family that had been destroyed. He thought of Thornton's desperate final diary entries, his plea to finish what he'd started. "No," he said firmly, "we bring it to light, all of it. We contact museums, historians, Holocaust survivor organizations. We make it so public that Caldwell can't touch it without exposing themselves." Desta nodded slowly. "Then we need to move fast." They worked through the night, organizing files, preparing statements, compiling lists of contacts. By dawn, they had a plan. Desta would reach out to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Marlowe would contact the FBI's art crime team. They'd document everything and make sure multiple copies existed in multiple locations. But they ran out of time. It happened on the 4th night after they'd found the vault. Marlowe and Desta had started sleeping at the estate itself, unable to leave it unguarded. They'd brought sleeping bags, battery-powered lights, and Marlowe's grandfather's old revolver, which he'd never fired but kept for emergencies. They'd set up camp in the parlor, choosing a room with multiple exits and a view of the driveway. Desta had just dozed off when Marlowe heard it, the crunch of gravel, footsteps, multiple sets. He shook Desta awake, pressing a finger to his lips. She nodded, instantly alert. Through the gaps in the boarded windows, they saw flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. 3, maybe 4 people, moving with purpose toward the house. Marlowe grabbed the revolver, his hands shaking. Desta pulled out her phone. No signal. They were too deep in the mountains. The front door rattled. Someone was picking the lock. Marlowe and Desta moved quickly, quietly, toward the kitchen at the back of the house. They'd explored enough to know the layout, to know there was a servant's entrance that led to the gardens. Behind them, they heard the front door open. Voices, low and professional, calling out, "We know you're here. We're not here to hurt you. We just want to talk about what you found." Marlowe and Desta reached the kitchen door. It was locked from the inside. Marlowe fumbled with the bolt, his arthritis making his fingers clumsy. Desta pressed against his back, watching the doorway they'd just come through. Footsteps in the entrance hall, getting closer. The bolt finally gave. Marlowe pushed the door open just as a figure appeared in the kitchen doorway behind them, flashlight blinding. "Wait," the figure called. But Marlowe and Desta were already running, crashing through overgrown gardens, branches tearing at their clothes. They heard shouts behind them, saw flashlight beams sweeping the darkness. Marlowe's chest burned, his breath came in ragged gasps. Desta grabbed his hand, pulling him forward. They reached the tree line and dove into the woods. Behind them, the voices receded. The flashlights stopped searching. After several minutes, the silence returned. Marlowe and Desta crouched behind a fallen log, gasping for air, hearts pounding. Through the trees, they could see the estate, dark except for lights moving inside. The intruders were searching the house. "We need to get help," Desta whispered. They made their way carefully through the woods, following the old road on foot. It took them nearly an hour to reach the main highway. A truck driver stopped when he saw them, an elderly couple covered in dirt and scratches, emerging from the woods like refugees. He drove them to the sheriff's station. This time, Walker listened more carefully, especially when Marlowe told him about the people currently inside their property. Deputies were dispatched. By the time Marlowe and Desta returned to Belcastle Manor with Sheriff Walker, the intruders were gone, but they'd left a message. In the entrance hall, spray-painted across the wall in red letters, "Final warning. Sell to us or lose everything." Walker radioed for backup and a forensics team. Then he turned to Marlowe and Desta, his expression grim. "All right," he said. "I think it's time you showed me what's really going on here." And as dawn broke over the Virginia mountains, Marlowe and Desta led the sheriff down into the vault, where $300 million worth of history waited in the darkness, and where the fight for the truth was only just beginning. Sheriff Walker stood at the entrance to the vault, his flashlight beams sweeping across rows of crates, and for a long moment he said nothing. His face went through several expressions: disbelief, shock, understanding, and finally something like fear. Not fear of the art itself, but fear of what it meant, what it represented, the kind of attention it would bring. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, "you weren't exaggerating." Desta stood beside Marlowe, her hand gripping his. "No, sir, we weren't." Walker moved deeper into the first chamber, examining crates, reading labels. When he reached the gallery, when he saw the paintings hung on those walls, he removed his hat and held it against his chest like he'd entered a church. "Do you understand what this is?" he asked quietly, not taking his eyes off the Rembrandt. "We do," Marlowe said. "We've been trying to tell you." Walker turned to face them, his expression grave. "This changes everything. This isn't a local matter anymore. This is federal, maybe international. We need to secure this site immediately, and you two need protection." By sunrise, the Belcastle estate was crawling with law enforcement. State police established a perimeter. The FBI's art crime team was en route from Washington. Walker had called in every favor he had to keep the media at bay for as long as possible, but they both knew it wouldn't last. Marlowe and Desta sat in the back of an ambulance while a paramedic checked them for injuries. Scratches, bruises, elevated blood pressure, exhaustion. Nothing serious, but the paramedic insisted they go to the hospital. They refused. "We're not leaving," Desta said firmly. "Not until we know this is protected." "Ma'am?" the paramedic started, but Walker interrupted. "Let them stay. They've earned that much." By noon, Special Agent Victoria Reese arrived from the FBI. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and efficient, with a reputation for recovering stolen art worth over $2 billion in her career. She spent 3 hours in the vault, emerging with an expression Marlowe couldn't quite read. She sat down with them in the parlor, now lit by portable generators the state police had brought in. "Mr. and Mrs. Hicks," she began, "what you've found is extraordinary. Preliminary assessment suggests this collection contains at least 40 pieces of museum-quality art, most of which were reported stolen or missing during World War II. The documentation you've discovered appears to authenticate their provenance. This is potentially the most significant recovery of looted art in the past 30 years. Marlowe and Desta looked at each other, the weight of those words settling over them. "What happens now?" Marlowe asked. Agent Reese pulled out a tablet. "Now it gets complicated. First, we need to verify everything: authentication, provenance, legal ownership history. Second, we need to determine rightful ownership. Some of these pieces may belong to museums, some to families, some are disputed. Third," she paused, looking at them carefully, "we need to address your legal position." "What does that mean?" Desta asked. "It means you purchased this property legally. According to Virginia law, anything on that property belongs to you. However, the original owners or their heirs may contest that. There are also federal laws regarding cultural artifacts, international treaties about stolen art, and moral obligations that supersede legal technicalities." "So you're saying it's not ours," Marlowe said flatly. Agent Reese shook her head. "I'm saying ownership is going to be determined by courts, historians, and probably international committees. But," she leaned forward, "you have rights too. You discovered this collection. You've already taken steps to document and protect it. Your intentions matter. Thornton Belcastle's will matters, if we can locate it." Desta reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded paper, a photocopy they'd made of a page from Thornton's diary. "He mentions a will. He says it's sealed with his attorney. He says there's a finder's fee." Agent Reese read it carefully. "Who was his attorney?" "We don't know," Marlowe admitted. "We haven't had time to research it." Agent Reese made a note. "I'll have my team look into it. In the meantime, you need legal representation. I can provide you with a list of attorneys who specialize in art recovery cases." "We can't afford attorneys," Desta said quietly. Agent Reese smiled faintly. "Trust me, after today you'll have attorneys volunteering to represent you pro bono. This case is going to be international news." She was right. By evening, the news had broken. Someone, maybe a deputy, maybe a paramedic, had leaked the story. Local stations ran it first. Elderly couple discovers Nazi-looted art worth hundreds of millions in condemned Virginia estate. By nightfall, it had gone national. By morning, it was international. Marlowe and Desta's phone, which they'd turned off to save battery, vibrated continuously when they finally powered it back on. Voicemails from reporters, attorneys, museum curators, people claiming to be relatives of Thornton Belcastle, and dozens of calls from numbers they didn't recognize. Their daughter Rachel called 14 times. When Desta finally answered, Rachel was crying. "Mom, what the hell is going on? I saw you on the news. They're saying you found stolen treasure. They're saying you're in danger. Please tell me you're okay." Desta closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her. "We're okay, honey. It's complicated, but we're safe." "I'm coming home," Rachel said. "I'm getting on a plane today." "No," Desta said firmly. "Stay with your family. We've got the FBI here, state police. We're surrounded by protection. There's nothing you can do except worry, and I won't have that," Rachel argued, but Desta held firm. Finally, Rachel made her promise to call every day, twice a day, and to not take any more risks. The media descended like locusts. News vans lined the road leading to the estate. Helicopters circled overhead until the FAA established a no-fly zone. Reporters shouted questions whenever Marlowe or Desta appeared. Cameras clicked like 1,000 insects. Sheriff Walker, overwhelmed, called for backup from State Police Public Affairs. They established a media checkpoint half a mile from the property and scheduled a press conference for the following day. But the media attention brought something else. People. By the second day, cars started arriving. Families who'd lost art in the Holocaust, descendants researching their heritage, survivors who'd been children when everything was taken. They came from New York, Florida, California. Some came from Europe. Agent Reese set up a makeshift office in the library and began documenting claims. Each person brought stories, documents, photographs. Each person carried decades of grief. Marlowe and Desta met as many as they could. An elderly woman named Ruth came from Baltimore. She was 87, bent with age, but her eyes were fierce. She carried a black and white photograph of a family standing in front of a large house. "This was my grandparents' home in Vienna," she said, her accent still thick after 75 years in America. 1938, the Nazis took everything. My mother was 12. She remembered a painting of mountains signed by someone named Cézanne. She described it her whole life, every detail. I brought her description, notarized, dated from 1963 before she died. Desta took Ruth's trembling hands in hers. "We may have found it. Would you like to see?" Ruth wept when Desta led her into the vault, when she stood in front of the Cézanne that matched her mother's description perfectly. She touched the frame with fingertips as light as prayer. "She never stopped believing it still existed somewhere," Ruth whispered. "She said art is stronger than hate, that beauty survives." She was right. There were dozens of stories like Ruth's. A man whose grandfather's Rembrandt had hung in their Berlin apartment. A woman whose family's jewelry had been seized in Prague. A couple whose parents had owned a gallery in Paris. Each person carried loss like a physical weight, and each person found something in that vault that helped them breathe again. But not everyone who came had pure intentions. On the 5th day after the discovery went public, a man arrived in an expensive suit with a leather briefcase and 3 lawyers. His name was Calder Belcastle, and he claimed to be Thornton's grandson. He demanded a meeting with Marlowe and Desta. Agent Reese allowed it, but insisted on being present, along with Sheriff Walker and the couple's newly appointed attorney, a sharp woman from Richmond named Patricia Dove, who'd indeed volunteered her services pro bono. They met in the dining room, sitting around a table that had probably hosted Thornton's private art showings decades ago. Calder was in his late 40s, well-dressed, confident in the way only wealth and privilege can create. He placed a folder on the table. "My grandfather," he began without preamble, "was Thornton Alexander Belcastle. When he died in 1987, his estate was divided among his children, my father included. The house was deemed worthless and sold at auction years later for pennies. But nobody," he paused for emphasis, "knew about the vault." Attorney Dove leaned forward. "And your point is?" Calder's smile was cold. "My point is that this collection was never properly inventoried as part of his estate. It should have gone to his heirs. The auction was conducted under false pretenses. The sale is invalid." Marlowe felt his chest tighten. Desta's hand found his under the table. "That's not how property law works," Dove said calmly. "Your family sold the estate. Any subsequent discovery on that property belongs to the purchaser. There's ample precedent." Calder's lead attorney, a man with silver hair and a voice like gravel, spoke up. "We're prepared to challenge that. We believe the auction company and the county conspired to conceal the true value of the property. We're filing suit to nullify the sale and claim the collection as rightful heirs," Agent Reese interjected. "Even if you were successful, which is unlikely, the collection itself is subject to restitution laws. Much of this art was stolen from Holocaust victims. Their families have claims that supersede any inheritance disputes." Calder's expression hardened. "My grandfather rescued that art. He risked his life saving it. That has to count for something." "It does," Desta said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She met Calder's eyes without flinching. "It counts as proof that your grandfather was a good man who wanted to do the right thing. But he didn't save that art for himself or for profit. He saved it to return it. If you really want to honor him, you'd help us do what he asked." Calder stared at her for a long moment, then gathered his papers. "You'll be hearing from our attorneys." He stood and walked out, his legal team following. After they left, Attorney Dove exhaled slowly. "He's going to make this difficult." "Can he actually win?" Marlowe asked. Dove hesitated. "Honestly, I don't know. He's got resources we don't. He can drag this out for years, tie everything up in court, make it expensive and complicated. And the media will love it. It'll become a circus." "So what do we do?" Desta asked. "We fight," Dove said, "and we do it the right way. We authenticate every piece, we document every claim, we find Thornton's will, and we prove beyond any doubt that your intentions align with his wishes." The authentication process began immediately. Experts flew in from the Getty, the Met, the Louvre. They examined paintings with infrared technology, X-rays, chemical analysis. They studied brushstrokes, signatures, canvas composition. Each painting took days to fully authenticate. The results were staggering. 31 of the 32 paintings were genuine. Masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Monet, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Klimt. The one exception was a piece attributed to Caravaggio that turned out to be an exceptional contemporary copy, still valuable but not priceless. The jewelry, coins, and decorative arts were similarly verified. Conservative estimates put the total collection value at $315 million. Some pieces were considered so rare that assigning monetary value was almost meaningless. But the authentication brought another complication. As the true nature of the collection became clear, more people came forward with claims. Some were legitimate descendants with documentation. Others were opportunists with flimsy connections and fabricated stories. Sorting through them became a full-time job for Agent Reese and her expanding team. Meanwhile, the town of Cedar Mountain, where Belcastle Manor was located, began to change. At first, locals were proud. This was their history, their mystery solved. But as the media attention intensified, as property values started rising, as tensions grew between the Hicks and the Belcastle family, opinions shifted. Some people thought Marlowe and Dester should keep the collection, sell it, become wealthy. Others thought they were being greedy for not immediately turning everything over to the government. Still, others believed Calder's narrative that the elderly couple had stolen his family's inheritance. The local diner became a battleground of opinions. The grocery store checkout line buzzed with gossip. Marlowe and Dester, who'd lived quietly on the margins of this community for decades, suddenly found themselves at the center of controversy. One afternoon, Dester went to the pharmacy to refill Marlowe's heart medication. The pharmacist, a man named Ted who'd filled their prescriptions for 20 years, barely looked at her. "That'll be $287, he said coldly. Dester handed him her credit card. "Ted, is something wrong?" He finally met her eyes. "People are saying you're sitting on millions while pretending to be poor. Makes folks wonder if you've been honest about anything." Dester felt like she'd been slapped. "We haven't kept a single penny. We're trying to return everything to the families who lost it." Ted processed the payment without responding. Dester left with tears burning in her eyes. Marlowe had similar experiences. At the post office, where he'd worked for 30 years, former colleagues avoided him. At the hardware store, the owner muttered something about treasure hunters ruining property values. Even at church, where they'd attended sporadically over the years, people whispered behind their hands. It hurt more than Marlowe expected. They'd never had much, never wanted much, never put themselves above anyone. And now, for doing what they believed was right, they were being treated like criminals or con artists. Only a few people stood by them. Sheriff Walker continued to support them publicly. Their neighbor who'd loaned them the camera brought over casseroles and refused to listen to gossip. And Ruth, the elderly woman who'd found her family's Cézanne, wrote a letter to the local paper defending them. The letter read, "I am a Holocaust survivor's daughter. When the Hicks family found my mother's painting, they didn't try to keep it. They wept with me. They helped me hold a piece of my family's history that I thought was lost forever. These are good people doing a hard thing. We should be thanking them, not tearing them down." The letter helped, but it didn't stop the tide of public opinion. Calder Belcastle, media-savvy and well-funded, gave interviews painting himself as the wronged grandson trying to reclaim his heritage. He told stories of Thornton as a misunderstood collector, suggesting the pieces had been legally acquired, implying the Holocaust angle was being exaggerated for sympathy. His narrative found traction, especially among people who didn't understand the historical context or who resented the attention the small town was receiving. The legal battle escalated. Calder's attorneys filed motion after motion to halt the authentication process, to freeze any transfer of the artwork, to grant the Belcastle family access to the vault, to nullify the original sale. Each motion required responses, hearings, legal fees that would have bankrupted Marlowe and Desta if not for Attorney Dove's pro bono work and a legal defense fund that Holocaust advocacy groups had established. Through it all, Marlowe's health deteriorated. The stress, the sleepless nights, the constant attention, it was too much for his 72-year-old heart. He started having more frequent chest pains. Desta begged him to go to the hospital, but he refused. "Not until this is finished," he insisted. "Marlowe," Desta said desperately, "what good is any of this if you die?" He took her hands, his grip weaker than it used to be. "If I die knowing we tried to do right. That's worth more than a few extra years of eating beans in a trailer." But fate intervened before Marlowe could make that choice. Attorney Dove called with news that changed everything. "We found Thornton's will," she said, excitement crackling in her voice. It was sealed with his attorney's firm, just like his diary said. The firm went out of business in 2003, but their records were transferred to the state archives. I had a researcher dig through everything. "Marlowe, Desta, this will changes the entire case." The will was dated March 1st, 1987, just 4 days before Thornton died. It was witnessed, notarized, legally binding, and its contents were extraordinary. Thornton had left specific instructions. The estate, including all buildings and land, was to be sold at public auction with no minimum reserve. Any artwork or valuables found on the property after the sale belonged to the purchaser, but with explicit conditions. The will stated, "I have spent my life preserving art that was stolen from innocent families during humanity's darkest hours. I could not return these pieces myself, as I failed to survive long enough to see my mission complete. Therefore, I entrust this final task to whoever discovers my collection. If they choose profit over justice, they will receive nothing but the market value of the art. But if they choose to return these pieces to their rightful owners or their descendants, if they honor the sacred trust I was given, then I bequeath to them $5 million from my estate, held in trust, to be released upon completion of repatriation. Additionally, the Belcastle estate itself shall transfer to them free and clear of all liens and taxes, restored at the trust's expense, to serve as a memorial or museum if they so choose." The will continued with detailed instructions for identifying rightful owners, procedures for disputed claims, and documentation required for each repatriation. Thornton had thought of everything. Most importantly, the will explicitly disinherited any family member who attempted to claim the collection for personal gain. Calder and his attorneys shall have no claim to these works under any circumstances, as they represent my children's greed that drove me to make this arrangement in the first place. When Attorney Dove finished reading, Marlowe and Desta sat in stunned silence. "He planned this," Desta finally said. "All of it. He knew his family wouldn't do the right thing, so he created a way to force it. And he chose to trust strangers over his own blood," Marlowe added quietly. Attorney Dove smiled. "The trust still exists. I've contacted the trustees, they've reviewed the situation, and they're prepared to honor Thornton's wishes. Calder's lawsuit is effectively dead. The will is ironclad." "What about the families?" Desta asked. "The ones waiting for their art?" Dove pulled out another folder. "We've verified 63 legitimate claims so far. The trustees are prepared to begin repatriation immediately. Each family will receive their pieces within 90 days, along with full documentation and Thornton's letters explaining how he acquired them." Marlowe felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight for weeks. "It's really going to happen." "It is," Dove confirmed. And once the repatriation is complete, you'll receive the finder's fee and ownership of the estate. You'll be able to do whatever you want with the property. The news broke like dawn after a long night. When the will was filed publicly and its contents revealed, the media narrative shifted overnight. Calder Castle, exposed as exactly the kind of greedy heir Thornton had predicted, withdrew his lawsuit and disappeared from public view. The town's opinion swung back in Marlowe and Desta's favor, though some people were too embarrassed by their previous judgment to apologize. But Marlowe and Desta didn't care about vindication. They cared about the families. The first official repatriation ceremony was held 6 weeks after the will was discovered. Ruth was given her family's Cézanne in a private ceremony at the Belcastle estate, now cleaned and partially restored by the trust's funds. She stood in the entrance hall, the painting held by museum handlers, and she spoke to a small gathering of family members, press, and officials. "My mother died believing her family's history had been erased," Ruth said, her voice breaking. But it wasn't erased. It was protected, hidden, kept safe by a man who understood that art isn't just paint on canvas, it's memory. It's proof that we existed, that we mattered, that we loved beautiful things. And now, thanks to Marlowe and Desta Hicks, thanks to their courage and their hearts, my grandchildren will know where they came from. The ceremonies continued, sometimes daily. A Rembrandt returned to a museum in Amsterdam that had been missing it since 1940. A Van Gogh reunited with the grandson of its original owner. Jewelry returned to families who'd thought their grandparents' lives had left no trace. Each ceremony was healing. Each one was proof that justice, however delayed, was possible. But the most powerful moment came near the end of the repatriation process. The final piece to be authenticated was the Vermeer, the most valuable single item in the collection. It had been stolen from a family named Kaufmann, who'd owned a textile business in Prague. The entire family, 11 people, had been murdered at Auschwitz in 1943. For months, researchers tried to find survivors or descendants. The Nazis had been thorough in destroying the Kaufmann line, but finally, through genetic databases and genealogical research, they found someone, a woman named Elena Silva living in Tel Aviv, whose grandmother had been a Kaufmann. Elena was 63, a retired teacher, and she'd known nothing about her family's history beyond the fact that they'd died in the camps. When Agent Reese contacted her, when Elena learned about the Vermeer, she booked a flight to Virginia immediately. Marlowe and Desta met her at the estate on a cool November morning, almost exactly 1 year after they'd bought the property for $875. Elena was small, dark-haired, with eyes that held old sorrow. Desta embraced her without words. Sometimes there was nothing to say. They walked together into the vault, now brightly lit and organized like a proper archive. The Vermeer hung on the wall, a woman reading a letter by a window, the light so real it seemed to glow from within the painting itself. Elena stood in front of it for 10 minutes without moving. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "In Hebrew, my grandmother's name was Chaya. It means life. The Nazis tried to erase her, tried to erase all of us. But here is proof that she existed, that she had beautiful things, that she mattered. This painting survived when she couldn't, and now I get to take her home." She turned to Marlowe and Desta, tears streaming down her face. "How do I thank you? How do I thank anyone for giving me back my family?" Desta took Elena's hands. "You don't thank us. You live. You remember. You tell their stories. That's the only payment we need." The ceremony for the Vermeer was international news. It was attended by the Israeli ambassador, representatives from the Czech government, Holocaust historians, and survivors from around the world. The painting would go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where Elena could visit it whenever she wanted, where it would stand as testament to the Kaufmann family's existence. At the ceremony, a historian gave a speech about the importance of restitution, about healing historical wounds. But Marlowe barely heard it. He sat beside Desta, holding her hand, feeling his heart beat irregular and tired in his chest, and he felt complete. They'd done it. They'd finished what Thornton Belcastle started. Every piece had been returned or was in the process of being returned. Every family had been contacted. The documentation was complete, and in 2 weeks after the final transfers were complete, Marlowe and Desta would receive their finder's fee and the deed to the estate, free and clear. But Marlowe knew he wouldn't live to see it. The chest pains had gotten worse. He could barely walk 20 feet without stopping to catch his breath. Desta knew too, though they didn't talk about it. Some truths were too heavy for words. On the night after Elena's ceremony, after everyone had gone and the estate was quiet, Marlowe asked Desta to walk with him through the empty vault one last time. Their footsteps echoed in the chambers that had held so much history, so much pain, so much beauty. "Do you regret it?" Desta asked quietly. Marlowe thought about the question. He thought about the $875 that had started this, about the fear and the threats and the legal battles. He thought about being mocked and doubted and attacked. He thought about his failing heart and the time it had cost him. Then he thought about Ruth's tears, about Elena's face when she saw the Vermeer, about the dozens of families who'd found pieces of themselves they'd thought were lost forever. "Not for a second," he said. Desta leaned against him, and they stood together in the empty gallery where ghosts of beauty had waited 70 years to go home. "Good," she whispered, "because neither do I." 3 days later, Marlowe collapsed in the entrance hall of the Belcastle estate. The paramedics came quickly, but it was too late. His heart, exhausted from a lifetime of work and a year of extraordinary stress, simply stopped. He died with Desta holding his hand, in the house that had given his final year meaning, surrounded by the legacy he'd helped restore. The funeral was small. Rachel came, of course, with her family. Sheriff Walker attended, Attorney Dove, Agent Reese. And to Marlowe's surprise, dozens of the families they'd helped. Ruth came from Baltimore. Eleanor flew from Israel. Others drove from across the country. They filled the small church, these strangers who'd become family through shared mission and healing, and each one told Desta the same thing. "Your husband was a hero. Not the kind in movies, but the kind that matters most. The kind who does right when no one's watching." 2 weeks after the funeral, the repatriation was officially complete. The trust released the $5 million to Desta, along with the deed to the estate, restored and clear of all debts. She was, on paper, a wealthy woman, but wealth was just numbers. What mattered was in her hand. A letter, the last one, found by the trustees in Thornton Belcastle's effects. It was addressed to finder of my collection. Desta read it alone in the parlour, Marlowe's absence a physical ache beside her. The letter began, "If you're reading this, you've done what I could not. You've returned these pieces to their homes, to their families, to the world. You've proven that decency still exists, that some people still value justice over profit. For that, you have my eternal gratitude. The money is yours, earned through your courage and your heart. Use it wisely, live well. But I ask one more thing. Keep the estate open. Make it a place where people can learn about what was lost and what was saved. Make it a place where history is remembered, not buried. Make it a beacon against forgetting. If you do this, if you turn my house into a memorial that teaches future generations about the cost of hatred and the power of preservation, then my life's work is complete. Thank you, unknown friend. You've given me peace. I didn't earn, but desperately needed. With deepest respect and gratitude, Thornton Alexander Belcastle." Desta folded the letter carefully and looked around the parlour, now restored to its original grandeur. She thought about Marlowe, about his dream of adventure, about how a 72-year-old mail carrier had become the hero of a story that would be told for generations. And she made her decision. She would keep the estate. She would turn it into what Thornton asked: a museum, a memorial, a teaching centre. She would use the money to endow it, to to staff it, to make it sustainable for decades to come. She would make sure Marlowe's name stood beside Thornton's as the men who'd understood that some things matter more than profit. And she would live there, in that grand old house, surrounded by the echoes of beauty and sacrifice for whatever years she had left. Because some stories don't end with death. They transform, they inspire, they become the bedrock upon which others build their own courage. And the story of two elderly people who paid $875 for a condemned estate and found $300 million in buried truth, that story would endure. Not because of the money, but because of what they chose to do with it. 6 months after Marlowe's funeral, the Belcastle Memorial Centre opened its doors. The estate, fully restored by the Trust's remaining funds and Desta's careful oversight, stood proud against the Virginia sky, no longer crumbling, no longer forgotten. The stone walls had been cleaned and repointed. The roof was new. The windows, once boarded and broken, now gleamed with hand-blown glass that matched the original 1920s craftsmanship. But it wasn't the restoration that mattered most. It was what the building had become. Desta stood in the entrance hall on opening day, wearing a simple black dress and a silver necklace Marlowe had given her on their 20th anniversary. Her hair, now completely white, was pulled back in the same bun she'd worn for decades. Her hands, still stained with soil from the garden she still tended, trembled slightly as she watched people stream through the doors. They came from everywhere: Holocaust survivors and their descendants, students on field trips, art historians, people who'd followed the story in the news, locals who'd doubted, then believed, then wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. The museum spanned all 3 floors of the mansion. The first floor told Thornton Belcastle's story, his early years as an art dealer, his growing horror at what was happening in Europe, his decision to risk everything to save what beauty he could. The exhibits included his diaries, letters from the families he'd helped, photographs of him meeting with resistance fighters and smugglers, and reproductions of the works he'd hidden since the originals had been returned. The second floor was dedicated to the families. Each piece that had been repatriated had its own display: photographs of the original owners, documentation of how it was stolen, the story of how Thornton acquired it, and images of the emotional reunions when it was returned. Visitors walked through room after room of human faces, real people whose lives had been destroyed but whose memories had been preserved. Ruth's mother smiled from a 1937 family portrait, standing in front of their Vienna home, with the Cézanne visible on the wall behind her. Elena's grandmother Chaya stood in a wedding photo, young and hopeful, with no idea what was coming. Dozens of families, hundreds of people, all given permanence through careful documentation and respect. The third floor, the turret room where Marlowe had once stood and dreamed, was now the Marlowe Hicks Memorial Library. It housed books on Holocaust history, art restitution, ethical archaeology, and preservation. Scholarships bearing Marlowe's name had been established for students studying these fields. His worn work boots, the ones he'd worn the day they'd bought the estate, sat in a glass case beside a placard that read, "He walked into the unknown with courage and came out with truth." But the heart of the museum was in the basement, in the vault itself. Desta had insisted it be preserved exactly as they'd found it. Visitors descended those same stone steps Marlowe and Desta had descended that first day. They walked through the chambers where crates had been stacked. They stood in the gallery where masterpieces had hung in darkness for decades. And they felt what Desta and Marlowe had felt: awe, grief, responsibility, hope. At the opening ceremony, with news cameras rolling and crowds gathered on the lawn, Desta was asked to speak. She stood at a podium set up on the front steps, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to moved to grateful. Her daughter Rachel stood beside her, along with her 3 grandchildren who'd flown in for the occasion. Desta cleared her throat, the microphone amplifying her soft voice across the grounds. "My husband Marlowe and I bought this house for $875, she began. "We thought we were buying a project, something to fix, to make useful again. We didn't know we were buying a mission." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Marlowe was a mailman. I was a librarian. We weren't rich. We weren't educated in art or history. We were just two old people who saw something nobody else wanted and thought maybe it deserved a chance. The crowd was silent, listening. What we found here changed our lives. It gave Marlowe's final year a purpose that made everything else he'd done. 40 years of carrying mail through rain and snow, 43 years of loving me, 72 years of being a decent man. It made all of that matter in a way we never expected. Desta's voice cracked slightly. He died before he could see this museum open. But I know he would have been proud. Not of the money, not of the attention, but of this. She gestured to the building behind her, of creating a place where people can learn that evil doesn't have to win, that beauty survives, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they're willing to try. She looked down at her notes, then folded them and spoke from the heart instead. Thornton Castle spent 40 years protecting these treasures. Marlowe and I spent 1 year returning them. But the real work belongs to all of you, to everyone who comes through these doors and decides to remember, decides to care, decides that history matters and justice is worth fighting for, even when it's hard, even when it's too late to save the people we've lost. Tears ran down her cheeks, but her voice stayed strong. This museum exists because my husband saw a crumbling house and chose hope over fear. I'm asking all of you to do the same. Look at broken things and see potential. Look at forgotten stories and choose to remember. Look at injustice and decide to do something about it, even if you're 70 years old and everyone thinks you're crazy. The crowd erupted in applause. People stood cheering, crying. Desta stepped back from the microphone and felt Rachel's arm around her shoulders. She'd done it. She'd honored Marlowe, honored Thornton, honored every family that had suffered. And now the work could continue. The first year was a whirlwind. Over 37,000 people visited the museum. School groups came weekly. Universities organized field trips. The museum partnered with the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, with Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, with institutions around the world. Documentaries were filmed, books were written. Marlowe and Desta's story became required reading in some high school curricula. But Desta didn't want celebrity. She wanted impact, so she established programs that went beyond passive observation. The museum offered genealogy services to help people research their own family histories. It held workshops on ethical collecting and restitution. It became a resource center for other families searching for lost art. And slowly, more art began to surface. Families who'd hidden pieces in attics, unsure what to do with them, brought them to the museum. Private collectors who'd acquired works of dubious provenance donated them for proper research and return. The museum became a hub for healing historical wounds. Desta threw herself into the work. It kept her busy, kept her from drowning in grief over Marlowe's absence. Every morning, she walked through the rooms, checking on exhibits, greeting visitors, making sure everything ran smoothly. Every night, she returned to the small apartment she'd created in the estate's former servants' quarters. She couldn't bear to live in the grand rooms. They were for the public now, for the mission. But the work couldn't fill the Marlowe-shaped hole in her life. Some evenings, she sat in the turret library, looking out at the valley, and talked to him as if he were still there, telling him about visitors who'd been moved to tears, about students who'd decided to study art history because of what they'd seen, about the small victories and ongoing challenges. "I miss you," she'd whisper to the empty room. "Every single day, I miss you." One afternoon in the museum's second year, Desta was giving a private tour to a group of donors when she noticed a man standing alone in front of the exhibit about Thornton's will. He was in his 50s now, wearing jeans and a simple jacket, looking nothing like the suited attorney-flanked figure who'd tried to claim the collection 2 years earlier. It was Calder Belcastle. Desta's first instinct was anger. This man had tried to steal what Marlowe and Thornton had protected. He'd called them thieves. He'd made Marlowe's final months even more stressful than they needed to be. But then she looked closer at his face. He wasn't studying the exhibit with resentment or bitterness. He was reading every word with something like shame. She finished the tour, thanked the donors, and approached him cautiously. "Mr. Belcastle," she said. He turned, startled, then his face flushed. "Mrs. Hicks, I didn't expect to see you. I can leave if you want." Desta studied him. "Have you been here before?" He nodded. 3 times. Always during the week when it's quiet. I didn't want to cause a scene. Why come at all? Calder looked back at the exhibit, specifically at the section showing Thornton's letter explaining why he'd disinherited his family. "Because I needed to understand what kind of man my grandfather really was, and what kind of man I'd become in comparison." Desta said nothing, waiting. "I never knew him," Calder continued. "He died when I was 11. My father always talked about him like he was a failure, a dreamer who wasted his fortune on art nobody wanted. We grew up resenting that house, resenting his choices. When I heard about the collection, I thought finally the old man did something right, something that could benefit us." He shook his head. "I was so focused on what I thought I deserved that I never asked what was right. I hired attorneys before I even knew what the art was, where it came from, who it belonged to. I just saw dollar signs and family pride. And now?" Desta asked. "Now I see what I tried to steal." He gestured around the museum. "I read those stories, about the families, about what they lost. I saw the photographs of the reunions, the grandmother crying because she thought her mother's painting was gone forever. And I realized my grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote that will. He knew his children would do exactly what we did. He was protecting the art from us." Calder's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I'm ashamed, Mrs. Hicks. I fought you and your husband during his final months. I made his death more stressful than it needed to be. I can't take that back, but I wanted you to know that I understand now. What you did, what you sacrificed, it was heroic, and what I did was exactly what my grandfather feared most." Desta took a long breath, feeling Marlowe's presence beside her, imagining what he'd say. Marlowe had been a man who believed in second chances, in the possibility of change. "Are you here just to apologize?" she asked. "Or are you here because you want to do something?" Calder looked at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Desta gestured toward the museum. "We need volunteers, people to help with research, with tours, with outreach. We need people who understand that this isn't about glory or money. It's about memory and justice. If you really want to honor your grandfather, help us continue his work." Calder's throat worked. "You'd let me do that? After everything?" Desta thought of all the families who'd forgiven decades of injustice, thought of Ruth who'd embraced the museum despite the Nazis killing her entire family, thought of Elena who'd found peace in recovered memory despite the horror of her grandmother's murder. "Yes," she said simply, "because holding grudges doesn't heal anything. Marlowe taught me that." Calder volunteered the next week. He started small, helping organize the archives, assisting with database entry. But over time, he became one of the museum's most dedicated advocates. He used his legal knowledge to help other families navigate restitution claims. He gave talks at universities about his grandfather's work and his own failures, turning his shame into teaching moments. His redemption became part of the museum's larger story. Even those who chose wrong at first could find their way to right. The museum's 3rd year brought unexpected developments. An elderly man in Poland contacted them, claiming his father had worked with Thornton Belcastle during the war. He had letters, documents, even photographs of Thornton meeting with resistance fighters. The man's name was Jakub Kowalski, and he was 89 years old. Desta arranged for him to visit, covering his travel expenses from the museum's budget. When Jakub arrived, walking slowly with a cane, she met him at the entrance and immediately saw the emotion in his weathered face. "My father died never knowing what happened to the art they saved," Jakub said in heavily accented English. "He always wondered if it survived, if Mr. Belcastle kept it safe." "I am here to finally answer his question." Desta took him on a private tour, showing him everything. Jakub wept openly in the gallery when he saw reproductions of pieces his father had helped smuggle. He touched the wall where a Rembrandt had once hung and whispered prayers in Polish. In the archives, Desta showed him Thornton's letters. There were 3 that mentioned Jakub's father by name, describing him as brave beyond measure and one of the finest men I've ever known. Jakub held those letters with shaking hands. "May I have copies?" he asked. "For my grandchildren, so they know their great-grandfather was a hero." "Of course," Desta said. "But there's more." She led him to a special section of the museum she'd recently added, the Wall of Rescuers. It honored everyone who'd helped Thornton save art, a memorial to unsung heroes who'd risked everything. Jakub's father's name was already there, along with 24 others. Jakub stood in front of his father's name, Stanislaw Kowalski, 1910 to 1973, and finally allowed himself to break down completely. Desta sat with him until he'd cried himself out, understanding that some grief takes decades to find its release. "We thought he was just a laborer," Jakub said eventually. "He never talked about the war, never told us what he'd done. We didn't know he was part of something this important." "He was," Desta said gently, "and now everyone who comes here will know it too." The story of Jakub's visit made international news. It sparked a movement. Other families began researching their own relatives' involvement in art rescue operations. The museum's wall of rescuers grew longer. Historians discovered new networks of resistance fighters who'd protected cultural heritage alongside human lives. The Belcastle Memorial Center became more than a museum. It became a research institute, a memorial, a teaching center, and a symbol of hope that even in humanity's darkest moments, people of courage had fought to preserve beauty and memory. By the museum's 5th year, Desta was 75 years old. Her health remained good, but she was tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. The work was enormous, the responsibility heavy. She'd poured everything into the museum, but she knew she couldn't do it forever. So she created a succession plan. She established a board of directors that included Holocaust historians, art experts, descendants of rescued families, and Calder Belcastle, who'd proven himself trustworthy. She hired a professional director to handle daily operations, and she transitioned from leader to advisor, stepping back slowly but never disappearing. The museum continued to grow. A new wing was added, funded by donations from grateful families and institutions. It housed a state-of-the-art conservation lab where visitors could watch experts restore damaged artworks. Another section became a digital archive, scanning and preserving thousands of documents so they'd never be lost again. And through it all, through every expansion and evolution, Marlowe's name remained prominent. Marlowe Hicks Memorial Library, the Marlowe Hicks Scholarship Fund, the Marlowe Hicks Award for Ethical Stewardship, given annually to someone who demonstrated integrity in cultural preservation. Desta made sure Marlowe's legacy lived not just in what he'd done, but in what he inspired others to do. On the 10th anniversary of the museum's opening, a special ceremony was held. Survivors from around the world attended. So did government officials, museum directors, and students who'd been inspired by the story. The ceremony was held outdoors on the estate grounds, under a tent that protected against the autumn drizzle. Desta, now 80 years old and moving more slowly, was asked to speak. She stood at the podium with Rachel beside her, her grandchildren, now adults themselves, standing in the front row. 10 years ago, she began, this house was a ruin. The people who'd entrusted their treasures to Thornton Belcastle were mostly dead. Their children were aging. Their grandchildren knew nothing of what had been lost. And my husband and I were just two old people trying to figure out what to do with a crazy purchase. The crowd chuckled softly. Desta smiled. Today this place stands as proof that it's never too late to do the right thing, never too late to heal old wounds, never too late to honor those who came before us. She looked out at the faces. Ruth, now 97, in a wheelchair but still sharp-eyed and fierce. Eleanor, who visited twice a year from Israel. Jakub, who'd moved to Virginia to be near the museum and spend his remaining years volunteering. Calder, who'd found purpose in continuing his grandfather's work. Dozens of families who'd been reunited with their history. Marlowe used to say that broken things deserved a second chance, Desta continued. He said it about old cars he fixed, about this house, about people. He believed nothing was beyond saving if someone cared enough to try. Her voice grew stronger. This museum is proof he was right. It's proof that ordinary people can change the world. Not with wealth or power, but with courage and stubbornness and refusal to accept that wrong should stay buried just because it's easier. She paused, emotion thick in her throat. Marlowe died before he could see any of this. But I feel him here every day, in every student who learns something new, in every family that finds closure, in every person who walks through these doors and decides to be a little braver, a little kinder, a little more willing to stand up for what's right. Desta looked up at the house, its stone walls solid and enduring. We paid $875 for a condemned building, and we found $315 million in stolen art. But the real treasure wasn't the money or even the artwork. It was the reminder that good people still exist, that justice matters, that memory is sacred, and that sometimes the most important adventures don't happen when we're young and fearless. They happen when we're old and stubborn and refuse to let the world tell us it's too late to matter. The audience rose as one, applauding, crying, celebrating not just the museum but everything it represented. Desta stepped back from the microphone and felt Rachel's arms around her, felt her grandchildren's hugs, felt the warmth of a community that had been built on the foundation of two elderly people's impossible choice. After the ceremony, as the crowds dispersed and the sun set behind the mountains, Desta walked alone through the museum one more time. She moved slowly through exhibits she could recite from memory, past photographs she'd studied 1,000 times, through the vault where it had all begun. In the gallery, she stood where Marlowe had stood on that first day, when they'd pulled back the cover on that first painting and realized what they'd found. She could still see his face, the shock and wonder and dawning understanding that their lives were about to change forever. "I did it," she whispered to his memory. "We did it. Exactly what you would have wanted." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something she carried everywhere. Marlowe's key to the estate, the old iron key Red had given them at the auction. She'd had it mounted on a chain after Marlowe died, and she wore it around her neck every day, hidden under her clothes, close to her heart. She held it up to the light, watching it catch the glow from the gallery lamps. Such a small thing, this key. But it had opened more than a lock. It had opened possibility, purpose, meaning. Desta made her way back upstairs and out onto the front steps. The grounds were empty now, quiet. The mountains rose dark against the evening sky. Stars were beginning to emerge, tiny points of light in the vast darkness. She sat on the top step, the same step where she'd sat with Marlowe that first day after the auction, when they were terrified and excited and had no idea what they'd gotten themselves into. She could almost feel him beside her, could almost hear his voice saying something wry and wise that would make her laugh despite everything. A car pulled up the driveway. Rachel got out and walked over, sitting down beside her mother. "You okay, Mama?" Rachel asked. Desta nodded. "Just saying goodnight to your father." Rachel rested her head on Desta's shoulder. "He'd be so proud of you." "Of us," Desta corrected. of everyone who helped finish this. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars multiply overhead. After a while, Rachel spoke again. "The museum wants to create a permanent exhibit about you and Dad. They're calling it the heart of the collection. Photos, your story, the journals you kept during those first months." Desta shook her head. "This isn't about us." "Mama," Rachel said firmly, "it absolutely is about you. You and Dad, you're the reason any of this exists. People need to know that heroes look like tired old people in threadbare coats who decide to care when everyone else walks away." Desta considered this. "Maybe," she conceded. "But only if the exhibit makes clear we were just the ones who got lucky enough to find it. Thornton did the real work. The families suffered the real loss. We just—" She paused, searching for the right words. "We just refused to look away." "That's what heroes do," Rachel said simply. They sat until the stars were thick overhead, until the temperature dropped and Desta's old bones began to protest. Rachel helped her mother up, and together they walked back to the small apartment where Desta had lived for a decade, surrounded by photographs of Marlowe and memories of their impossible year. The museum continued to thrive. Student groups visited by the hundreds. Survivors made pilgrimages. New art was discovered and repatriated. The stories multiplied, the healing continued, the work expanded. And Desta, though she grew older and slower, remained involved. She greeted visitors when she had the energy. She answered letters from students writing reports. She met with families still searching for lost treasures, offering hope and resources and the knowledge that someone cared. On what would have been Marlowe's 80th birthday, Desta organized a small private ceremony. Just close friends, museum staff, a few families they'd helped. They gathered in the turret library, surrounded by books Marlowe would have loved to read but never got the chance to finish. Desta stood in front of the group, holding a photograph of Marlowe from the day they'd bought the estate. He looked so alive in that picture, so full of nervous excitement. "Marlowe was born 80 years ago today," she said. "He spent most of those years being ordinary, in the best possible way. He delivered mail. He fixed things. He loved his family. He paid his bills. He never asked for attention or expected glory." She looked around at the faces listening. "But when given the chance to do something extraordinary, he didn't hesitate. Not because he was brave, but because he was good. And goodness, real goodness, doesn't need courage to do what's right. It just needs the inability to do what's wrong." Desta placed the photograph on a small memorial table they'd created. Beside it, she placed his worn work boots, his glasses, and a letter he'd written to Rachel when she was a child, giving advice about fixing broken things. "Sometimes the repair is what makes something valuable," he'd written. "The cracks show it survived." That letter had become Desta's philosophy. The cracks in their lives, Marlowe's death, the stress, the doubt, those cracks showed they'd survived something difficult, and the museum, built from those cracks, was more valuable because of them. As Desta's 80s progressed, she began preparing for her own end. She updated her will, leaving everything to the museum and establishing scholarships in both her and Marlowe's names. She recorded oral histories, ensuring their story would be preserved accurately. She wrote letters to her grandchildren, to be opened after her death, explaining why she and Marlowe had made the choices they'd made. In those letters, she wrote, "We didn't do this for you to be proud of us, though I hope you are. We did it because when life gives you the chance to matter, you take it. No matter how scary, no matter how hard, no matter how unlikely success seems. You try. And trying with a good heart is never wasted effort, even if you fail." She was 84 when her health finally began to decline seriously. The doctors said her heart was weakening, which seemed fitting. She'd poured so much of her heart into the museum that there wasn't much left for keeping her own body running. Rachel wanted her to move to a care facility. Desta refused. "I'm staying here," she said firmly. "In this house, where Marlowe and I did the most important work of our lives. I'm not leaving until I have to." The museum staff converted one of the first-floor rooms into a comfortable suite for her. They brought in nurses, medical equipment, everything she needed. And Desta spent her final months surrounded by the legacy she and Marlowe had built. Visitors still came to see her. Ruth, now 102 years old and the museum's oldest living connection to the original families, visited weekly, bringing flowers and stories. They'd sit together, two old women who'd survived everything the 20th century threw at them, talking about art and memory and the surprising directions life takes. Elena came from Israel one last time, bringing her grandchildren. She wanted them to meet the woman who'd given their family back their history. The children, too young to fully understand, were gentle and curious. They held Desta's frail hands and asked questions about the paintings and the war and whether she'd been scared. Sometimes, Desta told them honestly, but being scared is okay. It's what you do while you're scared that matters. Calder visited frequently, often reading aloud to her from books about art history or telling her about new restitution cases he was working on. Their unlikely friendship had become one of the museum's most powerful examples of redemption. One afternoon, with spring rain pattering against the windows, Calder sat beside Desta's bed and said, "I never thanked you properly." Desta looked at him with eyes that had grown cloudy but still saw clearly. "For what?" "For giving me a chance to be better than I was, for not judging me by my worst moment, for showing me what my grandfather really stood for." Desta smiled faintly. "We all deserve the chance to become who we're meant to be, even when we start out wrong." "Especially then," Calder said. Desta's final days were peaceful. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes believing Marlowe was there, sometimes clear-headed and present. Rachel stayed by her side, holding her hand, reading to her, telling her how much she'd always been loved. On a quiet Tuesday morning in late April, with birds singing outside and sunlight streaming through the windows, Desta woke briefly and looked around the room. The walls were covered with photographs. Marlowe, their life together, the families they'd helped, the museum in all its beauty. "We did good, didn't we?" she whispered to Rachel. Rachel, tears streaming down her face, squeezed her mother's hand. "You did amazing, Mama. You and Dad both." Desta's eyes closed. "Good. That's all I wanted. Just to do good." Those were her last words. She slipped away quietly as she'd lived most of her life, making no fuss, asking for nothing, leaving behind only love and legacy. The funeral was held at the museum, per Desta's wishes. Thousands came. The service was outdoors on the grounds, with Desta's casket placed at the top of the front steps where she'd given so many speeches. Marlowe's photograph sat beside her, finally reunited. Speakers told stories of her impact, students she'd inspired, families she'd helped, museum staff she'd mentored. But the most powerful moment came when Ruth, defying her age and infirmity, insisted on speaking. She was wheeled to the front, her voice weak but determined. "Desta Hicks was not a famous woman," Ruth said. "She was not wealthy or powerful or important by the world's standards. But she changed my life. She gave me back my mother's memory. She proved that ordinary people doing good things are more powerful than extraordinary people doing nothing. And she reminded me, in the last years of my long life, that hope is real, that justice matters, that love endures." Ruth paused, gathering strength. "This museum exists because an old woman and an old man saw a broken building and chose to care. They didn't have to. Nobody would have blamed them for walking away. But they stayed. They fought. They finished what a good man started 70 years before. And because of them, hundreds of families have closure. Thousands of students have been educated. Millions of people have been reminded that history matters and that we all have the power to heal old wounds if we're willing to try." Ruth looked at the casket. "Thank you, Desta. Thank you for everything. We will never forget you." Desta was buried beside Marlowe in a small cemetery near the estate. Their headstone was simple, just their names, dates, and a single line. They found treasure and chose justice. In the months after Desta's death, the museum established a new tradition. Every visitor who completed a tour was given a small brass key, a replica of the one Marlowe and Desta had used to open the estate. Attached to each key was a card that read, "This key represents possibility. Somewhere in your life, there's a locked door, a problem unsolved, a wrong not righted. Be brave enough to turn the key. Be stubborn enough to finish what you start. Be good enough to choose justice over profit." That's the legacy of Marlowe and Desta Hicks. That's the treasure they found, and that's what they're passing on to you. Thousands of these keys were distributed. People carried them as reminders, as inspiration, as challenges. The keys showed up in unexpected places, on the desks of activists working for justice, in the pockets of students deciding whether to speak up about wrongdoing, hanging from rearview mirrors of people who needed courage for their own impossible choices. The keys became symbols, not of wealth, not of discovery, but of the decision to care when caring is hard. The museum continued to grow. 10 years after Desta's death, it had welcomed over 700,000 visitors. 20 years after, it was one of the most respected Holocaust education centers in the world. 50 years after, when Rachel's grandchildren ran it, when every original survivor had passed away, it still stood as testament to the power of ordinary decency. And people still came, generation after generation, to stand in that vault, to walk those chambers, to see the space where $300 million in art had waited in darkness until two elderly people refused to ignore it. They came to learn about the Holocaust, about art theft, about restitution. But more than that, they came to learn about Marlowe and Desta Hicks, about two people who'd spent decades being invisible, struggling, surviving. Two people who'd eaten beans for dinner and patched their clothes and counted pennies. Two people everyone underestimated. Until the day they proved that heroes don't need capes or powers or fame. They just need hearts willing to break for justice and hands willing to work until it's done. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to believe broken things deserve fixing and brave enough to care when everyone else walks away. As the sun sets over the Castle Memorial Centre, now in its 75th year, a new generation of visitors walks through its halls, touching the walls where history waited, reading the stories of families restored, learning that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't gold or jewels or priceless paintings. Sometimes the greatest treasures are the choices we make when nobody's watching, the stands we take when it would be easier to walk away, the stubborn insistence that the world can be better if we refuse to accept that it's too late to try. Because for Marlowe and Desta Hicks, two ordinary people who bought a condemned estate for $875 and found purpose worth more than any fortune, it was never about the money. It was about proving that decency still exists, that memory matters, that ordinary people can be extraordinary if they simply choose to care. Their story doesn't end with death. It lives on in every key distributed, every student inspired, every person who decides that they too can make a difference, no matter how small, no matter how late, no matter how impossible it seems. That's the real legacy. That's the treasure that never tarnishes. And that's why their names will be remembered long after the paintings have faded, long after the building has crumbled, long after everyone who knew them has passed on. Because they proved something the world desperately needs to believe, that hope is real, that justice is possible, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to drive past someone in need. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe broken things still deserve to shine.